Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Lady killer. Guys, Henry VIII...
When presenting history in a public setting, there's a delicate line between...
Pause. Henry VIII, I'm curious to know, like, if you were to ask, like, any British person, an American historical figure, like who would be the most likely that most people would know? Because I think over here, it's Henry VIII. I think as bad as Americans are at history, I think if you ask them, like, do you know who Henry VIII is? I think a lot of them will maybe not give the most intelligent answer, but at least sort of know who you're talking about. So, Lady Killer. Okay. Overly Sarcastic Productions. Original link to the video, top of the description. Below that, link to the Discord. My name's Connor. Hope you're all doing well. Love y'all. Let's learn.
Putting famous figures... When presenting history in a public setting, there's a delicate line between putting famous figures on blast for the irresponsible, immoral, or just downright memeable, and falling into the trap of rewarding bad behavior with attention. In this regard, researching a notorious king becomes much like watching over a toddler. No hitting. Hands to yourself, please. Do not put that in your mouth. Negotiating for basic manners with a baby is hopeless, and so is expecting any better from a monarch, because they're both playing by a completely different rule set, and you can see it in their eyes that they know it too. And this is why I spend so few videos recounting the lives of big boy kings and their Tonka truck wars. It's just exhausting, and I always feel like I'm rewarding that bad behavior. But today, in the spirit of the Valentine's season, I'm going to talk about love. Or rather, whatever the hell Henry VIII was doing.
Wait, is this a recent video? That was a year ago. We are still around the Valentine's season.
Is some overlap. Whatever the hell.
I heard he was quite a handsome man in his younger days and did some okay things, if not good things, for England, but is overshadowed by what most Americans know him for, which is being a little chunky, coming from Americans, and killing wives.
Well, Henry VIII was doing. There is some overlap, but boy is it slight. So, to learn the story of England's most notorious lady killer as an object lesson in what never to do, let's do some history. We begin in England in the 1500s as young Prince Hal was an extremely captivating figure, admired in his day for his athleticism, charm, and good looks. Sure, he's at once better and worse than we're liable to give him credit for.
Hey,
a multilingual and multi-talented king, he was an artistic patron and participant in the Renaissance tradition. He was also full of a royally...
Guys, when was, I was about to say pole vaulting. What's the pole vaulting, but you're on a horse and you try to pole vault a human? Jousting. When was jousting, like, at its peak? Like, like... you were the frickin' man if you were the best jouster. 1400s, 15?
Saying he was an artistic patron and participant in the Renaissance tradition. He was also full of a royally insatiable appetite for food and women alike. Those traits were only matched by his impulsiveness, arrogance, and self-obsession. He got bored easily and was as distrustful as he was covetous. Henry's paranoia led to the death of queens, officials, religious dissenters, and nearly every advisor who ever served him. Yet, for the first 2 decades of his reign, he was popular in his court and among the subjects, in large part because he played the royal jock while his father's advisors and one notoriously corrupt Cardinal Wolsey ran the kingdom. But even early on, he couldn't leave well enough alone. Bored of being merely a celebrity, Henry wanted to get the blood rushing by winning glory. So, as ever, the clearest option was in France. Yet, as ever, it did not work, costing the entire treasury in one go and only proving that poor tiny England absolutely could not compete with the great powers of Europe. So, with great frustration, he turned his focus back to England. And this would prove especially bad news for his wife, Catherine of Aragon, as it's here where Henry's reign surpasses the generically inept and descends into the true hallmark of his career, religion-shattering horniness. Now, before we progress, it...
Snorted. That's a hell of a sentence.
True hallmark of his career, religion-shattering horniness.
I'm interested.
Now, before we progress, it is my historian's responsibility to remind you that people are complicated and memes are not. So we're on the receiving end of a 500-year gossip circle that we ourselves perpetuate every time we laugh at old King Six Wives instead of thinking through what the history meant for the actual human people who lived it. Henry certainly belongs in horny jail, but we can't...
Guys, horny jail. there's this cup that, like, somehow if you're like greedy and like you want to pour yourself too much wine or alcohol, it will spill on your lap somehow. Like there's this thing where like if it reaches a level, there's a suction and it all goes on your lap, which is, I think, is pretty funny. I heard about that. Is that
actual human? Time we laugh at old King Six Wives instead of thinking through what the history meant for the actual human people who lived it. Henry certainly belongs in horny jail, but we can't pat ourselves on the back if we reduce an extremely consequential chapter of English history to the joke answer. So let's consider, what did Henry want? In a word, a son.
A male?
Henry grew up in the wake of the War of the Roses and was acutely aware of how catastrophic the line of succession would get without a clear male heir. His Tudor dynasty was new and it was not guaranteed to stay in power. Henry was married to the stately Queen Catherine of Aragon, but after 2 decades of marriage, no son. Lots of infant mortality and one...
Guys, wouldn't it have been easier instead of like, what if he just made it that like, okay, women can now be the successor? Like, if he's so powerful, isn't that a loophole? And then have her change it back?
Aragon, but after 2 decades of marriage, no son. Lots of infant mortality and one daughter, Mary, who survived to adulthood, but Henry figured that wouldn't cut it in a fiercely patriarchal society like medieval Europe. Catherine had been a good queen and a good wife, but once she was past childbearing years, Henry had no use for her. He had plenty of mistresses, but illegitimate sons would do him no good either. What he needed was a brand new wife. And people had done this before. Divorce, per se, was not recognized by the church, but you could get an annulment where the Pope says, oh, that marriage? Yeah, that never happened. You've actually been single the whole time. In fact, Catherine...
Both of Henry's sisters had their marriages annulled. Mary Tudor was Alabama, betrothed to Emperor Charles V, but the Pope broke the contract. Frickin' Pope, man. Margaret Tudor divorced in 1527 and remarried later that year.
Oh, per se was not recognized by the church, but you could get an annulment where the Pope says, oh, that marriage? Yeah, that never happened. You've actually been single the whole time. In fact, Catherine was first married to Henry's brother, but after he died, the marriage was annulled so she could marry Henry. But this time, the Pope was unmovable. Diplomacy, bargaining, saying pretty please, Rome would not budge. In Europe, Henry was powerless. But in England, he was the one in charge. In 1532, a decade and a half after Martin Luther woke up and chose mayhem, Henry broke with Rome and declared that the church in England was answerable only to the king. Some of Henry's advisors objected, so naturally Henry had them killed, and some Catholics in the north rebelled, so naturally Henry had them crushed as well. Everyone else carried on with their day for fear of the harsh new anti-treason laws. And with that, I
can't read and listen at the same time. Good golly, we sure do love being loyal to the supreme authority of the Church of England and His Highness the King. Big fans. Some North Korea stuff.
For fear of the harsh new anti-treason laws. And with that, Henry had his church, his annulment, and his new wife, Anne Boleyn. She had been a court lady to Catherine, and when Henry started making kissy faces at her, she refused to be a mistress and insisted he marry her properly before any slamming was to begin. Honestly, well played. A few very short months after their marriage, Anne gave birth to the future Queen Elizabeth, but that was it. Uh-oh. In the midst of all that, Henry was struggling to reconfigure his monarchy now that he was the head of the Church of England. He became responsible for giving alms to the poor and happily confiscated all of the old church lands.
Henry confiscated his way into owning 15% of English land, but later had to sell it all away to the nobility because he blew the treasury on another war. Hashtag just king things.
He became responsible for giving alms to the poor and happily confiscated all of the old church lands. However, he had neither the time nor patience for another sonless wife. Blissfully unaware of how chromosomal genetics actually works, he concluded that this marriage was also cursed and had her in—
Is that true? How do we know that the male decides the sex? How do we know that? I'm not saying it's false.
And executed for adultery and treason. Zoinks. This kind of frivolous cruelty also undermines the entire hoist of doing Protestantism in the first place, which frankly is typical Henry. Henry's subsequent betrothal to Jane Seymour the next day would finally net him the son he always wanted. Never mind what Edward VI was like as king, because he'd be succeeded 7 years later by Mary and Elizabeth anyway, so this whole
Wait a second.
typical Henry. Henry's subsequent betrothal to Jane Seymour the next day would finally net him the son he always wanted. Never mind what Edward VI.
Why does Edward VI look more like Anne Boleyn than Jane Seymour?
Next day would Henry's subsequent betrothal to Jane Seymour the next day would finally net him the son he always wanted. Never mind what Edward VI was like as king, because he'd be succeeded 7 years later by Mary and Elizabeth anyway, so this whole exhausting ordeal is the result of one man's paranoia, lust, and enthusiasm for beheadings. But with the mission finally complete, do you know what happens to Jane Seymour? She died of an infection 2 weeks later. I don't know whether to be sad for her awful luck or relieved that she didn't live to see what it's like when Henry got a whiff of someone else's perfume. But with his beloved bloodline preserved, Henry turned back to—
Guys, just fast on. Rip, Jane Seymour. You gave Henry the male heir he always wanted, and then courteously spared Henry the cost of the annulment papers and the executioner's hourly fee. His Highness the King is more grateful.
got a whiff of someone else's perfume. But with his beloved bloodline preserved, Henry turned back to foreign policy and failed—
You gave me a child and died. Double.
just as— But with his beloved bloodline preserved, Henry turned back to foreign policy and failed just as badly as he did when he was a teenager. He wanted a German Protestant wife as a check against Emperor Charles V and chose Anne of Cleves in 1540, a mail-order bride he picked from a portrait gallery. But Henry McSleepsaround suddenly got all choosy and annulled the marriage the same year because Anne didn't look enough like her portrait. Rude. That said, this ended
Catfishing.
a lot better than it very easily could have, so let's take the win and
Spent the next 17 years living it up in 2 palaces with all the privileges of a royal family member, but with absolutely none of the responsibilities or implicit marital dangers associated with being queen. Anne of Cleves was what a full-on boss. Good for her. Nice.
move on. He next married Catherine Howard. There was a religious strategy to this. I don't care. And he eventually had her executed for adultery as well. Restraint? In this kingdom? Speaking of, he started some wars again. Didn't super work, plus the treasury was back to empty. Oh well, let's meet the last wife. Catherine Parr was a Protestant widow who served as regent while Henry was at war in France.
I've never heard of her. What the hell?
Well, let's meet the last wife. Catherine Parr was a Protestant widow who served as regent while Henry was at war in France and made a point to formalize Mary and Elizabeth's places in the royal succession, thus making Catherine Parr the actual MVP of the Tudor dynasty. In any case, it was good timing because 4 years later—
Guys, just
Let's meet the last wife. Catherine Parr was a Protestant widow who served as regent while Henry was at war in France and made a point to formalize Mary and Elizabeth's places in the royal— served as regent while Henry was at war in France and made a point to formalize Mary and Elizabeth's places in the royal succession, thus making Catherine Parr the actual MVP of the Tudor dynasty.
How nice of her.
In any case, it was good timing because 4 years later, Henry died, leaving our last Catherine to live her best
What did he—
life. Oh, what a mess. A king with his priorities so twisted in knots, he wasn't sure whom he wanted to marry or kill, so he did everything to everyone and called it a day. Henry's 38 years on marry.
all of them in that order. Or no, the reverse order. No, actually, what?
Kill, so he did everything to everyone and called it a day. Henry's 38 years on the throne were some of England's most consequential due to his sweeping reforms of church and state, but all that sprang from the remarkable women whom he called queen. These 6 stick in our minds because of Henry's distinct notoriety, but any prominence he has in English history is owed quite thoroughly to the captivating effect they had on him, and in turn, on us. And so we've come full circle to our starting comparison. Like monarch, like toddler, they want their mommy. Thank you for watching. Before I go wash my mouth out with soap for that mommy joke. God. Prominence he has in English history is owed quite thoroughly to the captivating effect they had on him, and in turn, on us. And so we've come full circle to our starting comparison. Like monarch, like toddler, they want their mommy. Thank you for watching. Before I go wash my mouth out with soap for that mommy joke, God, I'll give my adaptation seal of approval to Six the Musical, because what it lacks in analysis of the geopolitical and theological factors that contributed to the English Reformation, it more than makes up for in raw queenly vibes.
Why do I feel like every time I try to learn about Henry VIII, it becomes a little bit more confusing, and then less confusing, and then more gross? But then also kind of cool. No. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. Answers to any of my questions. Any comments at all. Love y'all. My name's Connor. Would love for you to like and subscribe. Completely free. So hopefully we can watch another video together next time. Bye, guys.